I think it is possible that this video is going to be seen by a lot of farmers, and I just want to make it clear who I am. I'm a retired water resource engineer who did a lot of climate modelling back in the 1970s because I needed to be able to forecast extreme droughts, extreme floods, etc. And so my hydroclimatology work is what got me into climate science, if you like. I make no money out of what I'm doing now at all. And in fact, I highly subsidize all my actions so that I can spend many hundreds of pounds in a week going to London, having meetings, doing various things. And I am not in any way making money. So why am I doing it? What's the angle? Well, I'm 79 years old. I've got 10 grandkids and 4 kids, and I want them to have a better life. I don't want them to be fooled by what's going on with net zero. Frankly, the dishonesty of it drives me mad. So I'm not doing this for any gain by me whatsoever. I sometimes get paid just the expenses to go to a meeting, never paid for my time, and often I don't have any expenses to claim. I just have to take her out my own pocket. So I'm not begging in any way. I'm just explaining to you that there's no upside for me in this other than finding out the truth. The environmental movement is the exact opposite. Many careers, their mortgages, their livelihoods depend on keeping the scarce stories going. You judge for yourself at the end. I just thought that little prelude may introduce me a bit better to people who haven't seen me on video before. Thank you. On the Nana Akua Show on GB News yesterday, and it's the first time actually that I was asked what subject you want to discuss, and I chose Welsh farming. And the reason is because what's going on in Wales is just a forerunner of some real big disasters coming to farming, because the entire net zero movement is determined to do away with farming as we know it, and farmers are really going to suffer. In Wales, we're even educating kids and trials in schools to eat insects. And this is all based on a myth. Well, it's based on a complete fabrication, a con about CO2 and about climate change. And I have now done well over 100 videos exploding this myth and always been willing to debate with everybody on this subject. And people just run away from that debate. This was my second session with Mr. McCarthy, Donica McCarthy, who is an environmentalist. I hate to use that word because he's all for chopping up birds and wind farms and everything, you know. And there won't be any red kites left in Wales, I'll tell you, if we put up all the wind farms. So I decided to make it on Welsh farming because, you know, I live in Wales. I'm very proud of Wales. I think the farmers do a great job. And so here we go. But in doing this, I'm going to be delivering a message to the farmers of Wales, because unless they realise that the net zero is not true, the whole basis is not true, that there is no scientific evidence for it, but a huge amount against it, unless they realise that, then they're going to be tricked into further and further concessions as we go on, and farming is destroyed as we know it. Now, I'll start by doing the Nana Akua Show, and I'll dissect the show as I normally do, and I'll intercept at the right points. Now, if you're not used to seeing me on this show, I have very limited time, and my problem is I know a bit too much. I have about 6 different angles I could go on at any one time, and I don't know what's coming up. But I'll explain this as we go, and so we're going to start with the show, and the subject, thankfully, is on Welsh farm. Well, what's happening to the Welsh farmers? Here we go.
Good afternoon. It's 17 minutes after 3 o'clock. If you just tuned in, welcome on board. This is GB News. We are the People's Channel. I'm Nana Akua, and it's time now for Climate Control, where we unpick the debate around the climate. Farmers in Wales are warning that their industry will be at risk if the Welsh Government is planned to go ahead with proposed changes to farming subsidies. Outside the Welsh Parliament, they protested against plans which require 20% of their agricultural land to be set aside for environmental initiatives. The Welsh Labour government insists that the changes are necessary to fight climate change, but also conceded that the plan could still be adjusted at the end of a consultation. Unions warn that there'll be thousands of job losses. So is this really necessary? I'm joined now by Donica McCarthy, Director of the Climate Media Coalition, and also climate scientist Paul Burgess. Donica, I'm going to come to you first. Is this really necessary?
Absolutely. What's quite extraordinary about this, of course, is Welsh farmers voted for Brexit. What has Brexit done? It's done two things. First of all, it meant a £1.1 billion cut to the Welsh Government's budget, including £250 million for rural affairs. So that's £250 million out of the rural Welsh economy. And second, it set an end to subsidies for doing nothing. Under the European system, farmers in Wales got 67% of their income from the government for doing nothing. Sheep farmers up to 88%. And so what now the government is doing is you must do something in return. And what they must do in return is a number of things for Wales. Wales got a problem with flooding, and what additional trees do to farms, it retains the water on the farm so the flooding doesn't hit the downstream towns. And in droughts, it retains water in the land so there's some moisture there for the crops and for the society at large.
Well, that, of course, is a total fabrication. And let me explain why it is. And I'm a water resources engineer background, and, I used to be the water resources engineer for Gwynedd River Authority and then for Wales, planning all water resources. So I've actually managed flood control systems, and my job was predicting floods, etc. So let's look at just what that man has just said. You didn't know it, but the trees are going in to apparently stop flooding. Well, it's true that trees do attenuate the water, rainfall, and reduce the rate of flow into the rivers. But there's no plan here to plant trees in particular places where this would have an effect. And in fact, on the very upper catchment areas of rivers, the amount of water flowing is quite small. That's the smallest part of the catchment. It gets smaller and smaller as you proceed upstream. And therefore, we'd have to be planning to put the trees in particular places to have any effect at all, and it would take many years, of course. And when they're not doing that, they're just saying, you've got to have 10% anywhere. So that's a myth to begin with. This is typical of the front, the total misinformation they give. So it is absolutely absurd. As regards flood history, we'll take a look at it later when I start to answer this. But I just thought I'd stop the conversation there. I'd stop the discussion there to point out that this is a total myth. And what they would have to show is we're going to plant trees there, we're going to plant trees here to reduce floods, and this is the net effect of reducing floods. That's what they'd have to show. That's the benefit they'd have to show. No attempt to show it, just words, just environmental nice words, not science.
So what they're asking them to do, for example, at the moment, 7% of farms are covered in woodland. They're asking them to increase that to 10%, and they're asking for 10% of land for habitat.
This is how the environmentalists, like Mr. McCarthy, give misinformation. Yes, some farms, if you take farms in Wales, some have a lot more forestry than 10% already. Others have none. This draconian measure is going to go whack to everybody. So it's meaningless to use that. And the fact that some farms already have it is immaterial. When you look at the natural effect, the inevitable effect of this programme, it is going to take land away from Welsh farmers. That I'm talking here about the forestry. Never mind everyone given the 10% to wilding. So it's a bit misrepresented there, and I just thought I'd point that out.
Well, this is really good news. The problem is the UK government has cut the budget by £250 million, so the Welsh government has to cut and tail because of that.
I really was amazed that he went into all this stuff about the EU and the budget, because it's not to do with the issue, actually. It really isn't. And I think the UK government maintain they have not done that. It's the same amount of funding, but it doesn't matter whether that's true or not, because it's not the issue. This takes the focus away from the theft of land from farmers. And if there's reduced income, let's say he was right and there is reduced income, and I don't know, I don't have to know, then it could still be spent differently to confiscating your land. So I'll carry on, but that's just a little point.
All right. Paul Burgess.
Well, it's irrelevant, the money and the Brexit. I'm not going to go into that and waste time on that. The net effect of all this, the net effect is that farms are losing up to 20% of their land, right? And they're losing 10% on forestry and 10% on wilding. Now, these small farms, really, that makes them uneconomic. Now, what I'd like to ask is, what is the benefit of this? What is the benefit of doing that 20% off? And they don't give you a benefit. On the other side of this argument, there is no... Well, I want to know the mathematics of how... No, let me finish. I didn't interrupt you. The mathematics, what are they? Just how many degrees centigrade, or 10,000th of 1 degree centigrade, will we actually save in the future from this? So if you're going to take action to take property away from people, and that's what they're doing in Wales, and they've made it clear there's no compromise. No compromise. Our leader, Mark Drakeford, has made that absolutely clear. They're up in arms, the farmers in Wales, and it's a survival thing. And this is only the beginning of this madness. It's only the beginning. They've basically got no right to come into a farm and say, you do this and you do that, unless they can show a clear benefit. And there is no calculation, nothing is done, no cost-benefit analysis. So that's the point. What right have they got to do it without pointing out the benefit? And by the way, we need more CO2, not less. And the methane...
But surely if they plant more trees,
yes,
that will provide more CO2, would it not?
No, it sequesters it. It pulls it in for temporary until the tree's done away with at the end of its life. So as regards the flooding that was mentioned, by the way, it happened to be the water resource engineer for Wales in charge of that particular thing. And as the Met Office said in their report, there is no evidence of more flooding and so on. As the IPC say, again, worldwide there's none. So all that's a myth. So under these myths and this religion of climate change, and it's a religion we're fighting here. It's a doctrine, and they don't quantify it. Now, I've just done a video. I'm sorry for the language, but it's called "Are Farts Dangerous?" And if people go on YouTube, "Are Farts Dangerous" by you Paul Burgess, you'll find it, because it's a pretty unique title. And it explains methane. When you double methane, you can't even measure the difference to warming. You can't even measure it. And when you double CO2, you get 0.7 of a degree. But that's without the mitigation of clouds, etc. So all of that's in that video. It's a myth. All of this is a myth.
So you're saying that it's not really necessary to grow more trees, because that's what they're saying. This is to sort of help with the future effects potentially of climate change. Which I think they must mean lots of flooding and these
There's no evidence.
There's no evidence, he says.
The Met Office has said for every degree rise in temperature, there's a 7% rise in moisture held in the atmosphere.
Well, I wouldn't trust a word the Met Office says these days on the climate side. Absolutely ridiculous. In fact, all they can manage these days, despite this huge expansion based on climate, of course, is maybe to forecast the weather at the best 5 days ahead. They haven't really progressed a lot in all these years. Nevertheless, the point that the warmer the planet, the more moisture is, that's true. That is a true general point. But we're talking here about maybe warming 1.2, 1.3 degrees since 1850. So when he says, but the assumption here, of course, is carbon. The assumption is that it's carbon causing the atmosphere to increase in temperature. In his world, he'd have been happy, it seems, staying in the Little Ice Age. He'd have been happy when the Thames froze over. He'd been happy when crop yields were absolutely terrible instead of the records they are today, because CO2 is not the major factor. It is not the control knob. I've done a video called More CO2 Please. Please watch that. But it's also made clear in the video Are Farts Dangerous? CO2 is not the problem.
This winter has been the wettest winter ever in UK history.
Since how long were those records recorded?
17th century.
Well, I'm afraid that is totally untrue. It's classified as a fabrication. The wettest winter ever since the 17th century, that's between 16 and 1700 the records began in, and it was claimed that the Met Office were the source for this. It is not true. We didn't have any rainfall recording systems of any quality back then. And in actual fact, I'm now going to show you some evidence that even the Met Office don't claim this. This was a total fabrication. Now, I'm not particularly interested in my work in looking at one single winter. I would look at it over a period of time. You know, are we getting wetter and wetter winters over the last 100 years or so? In actual fact, there is slightly more rainfall over the last 100 years or so, as we've warned. That's absolutely true, but it's a very small amount. Now, I couldn't refute that without checking it. And the reason was that I knew the Tonga eruption of the underwater volcano in Tonga had put into the stratosphere something like 10 to 12% more water vapour than was there before. And I didn't know what the effect was going to be for the next 2 or 3 years. So I was wondering, is it possible we've had the wettest winter? I didn't know. But of course I've checked since. And we didn't even start the records back then. So again, I'm going to take a look at the official records that I could find. And you'd be surprised to know that, of course, it was wetter. There were worse storms, etc., back in the 18th and 19th centuries. And to argue differently is simply wrong. But this is part of the alarmist narrative. It's all built on scaring you. So here's some data. In this 2014 report from the Met Office, they stated that national records began in 1910. They do go on to mention that some records came from England and Wales as far back as 1766, but they were just individual gauges and not properly calibrated. Very sketchy. They really can't base the country's rainfall for old country like Wales or England on them. So the national records for rainfall began in 1910. Let's go on to the next bit of information. Well, in this report, the Met Office said something differently. They say that nationwide records began in 1891. And not to be outdone in the alarm mistakes, a Reading University professor said just currently that we had the wettest winter in 130 years. So was it wetter then? And by the way, that puts it at 1894. I've done many videos on this, on storms and the history of extreme weather, because the facts are weather in every sense was more extreme in the past than it has been. So let's go back to history very quickly. The 1703 storm was probably the worst storm we have ever got a record of, killed thousands of people. And we could go on to the next storm. The next storm after that was a pretty bad one, and that was in 1881, the Eyemouth disaster. A really, really bad storm in 1881. And I'll just end with this one. And this is the storm of the Great Blizzard in 1891. So we had really had bad weather back then. But what does the Met Office say about current weather and storms? Well, here is a graph from the Met Office. And what it shows is the rainfall records in graphical form for each year. And look back in those early times before 1900. It was wetter. It was actually wetter then. Now, don't expect government agencies and quangos like the Met Office or the Environment Agency to get their message right, because look at the foreword by Sir James Bevan, who probably knows nothing about the subject, by the way, in their report. Climate change is causing long spells of dry weather that are putting our water resources under increased pressure. May 2020 has been the driest on record, and exceptionally dry weather across the southeast between 2017 and 2019 led to some of the lowest groundwater levels ever seen. What total nonsense. Now let's look at the information on that one. Well, it turns out rather than May 2020 being the driest on record, it was the 9th driest on record since 1862. And I've done real detailed reports on this in other videos. By far the worst droughts in our entire history were in the 17th and 1800s. 17 and 1800s were by far the worst droughts. And the funny part is when you get cold weather, you get bad droughts. Even our 76 drought, 1976 one, was in a cold decade when they were claiming the Ice Age was coming. And we had an incredible drought. But that doesn't even rank anywhere near the top in regard to our history of droughts.
So you're saying the water
some farmers
from the 17th century.
Let me finish. Some farmers have up to 5 meters flooding.
No, you don't understand. When I say be quiet, you stop talking. because we're going to come back to that. So you said the 17th century, the records were measured for flooding. Is that for rainfall? Did you say rainfall?
Yeah, rainfall.
Is that correct?
Well, yes, but they have been measured a long time, but not accurately for rainfall. But what matters is the flooding. Right, flooding depends on many, many factors. For example, when you urbanise a place, you're going to get quicker runoff from flooding, etc. If you improve flood protection for a town, all you've done is move the water faster downstream, so you can cause more flooding. So it's a much more complex thing than measuring a drought, for example. But the worst weather, if we're going to go to the 17th, 18th century, the worst droughts were then by a mile. The worst weather was then by a mile. And even, let me finish this, with the Met Office, they're just in trouble at the moment because they are in total denial about something. They went on air and said a recent storm was to do with climate, and they were asked to give the evidence for that under a freedom of information, and the information wasn't there. It proved the opposite. Their annual report said the 80s, and I've used it on this show before, I've read it out.
So this is the Met Office report, State of the UK Climate 2021. I'll read it to you. The most recent 2 decades have seen fewer occurrences of maximum gust speeds above these thresholds than during the previous decades, particularly comparing to the period before and after 2000. The earlier period before 2000 also included amongst the most severe storms experienced in the UK in the observational records, including Burns Day storm in the 25th of January 1990, the Boxing Day storm of the 26th of December 1998, and the Great Storm of the 10th of October 1987. Storm Eunice was the most severe storm to affect England and Wales since February 2014. But even so, these storms of the 1980s and 1990s were very much more severe. So you had more severe storms in the 80s and 90s than you have up to 2021. That's from the Met Office themselves. Yet today, when caught out with a freedom of information request that could find no support for their claim that a particular storm was caused by climate change, they refuse to apologise. And the reason is very simple. The political agenda does not allow them to.
The 80s and 90s were far more frequent storms and far more severe.
Okay. So
and now they deny it.
All right. Okay.
Thank you.
Follow their own science.
I said it was the wettest winter ever. You turned around to him and asked him, was it the wettest winter? He didn't answer your question.
No, he did. No, he did.
Ask him then.
No. He did answer it, and he said that it was wet in that time as well. So carry on.
No, he said there were lots. The records went back to the 17th century, and he said the weather was bad in those days. He didn't say that this was not the wettest winter ever.
Okay.
The second thing.
Are you going to say, was it the west winter? Is this the wettest winter?
No, I don't think it is. But can I just say, just had the tongue.
No, you're not going to say anymore.
Okay.
Carry on.
Okay. I think that's the answer. It is the wettest winter ever, according to the Met Office. The second point is that we actually disagree.
1700s.
That's right.
Since we've recorded.
Yeah, fair point. The second point is actually something we agree on. He actually said if you channel the water off the farms down river, you flood the towns.
I didn't say that.
Now, one of the things that what woods do.
No. He said that it moved
towns, urbanisation.
further down.
Faster down.
Flood protection.
It moves it down, so he's actually talking flood protection.
What I actually said was if you flood protect a town, you'll move the water through there faster, and that faster water through there could cause worse flood conditions downstream. That's a fact. Basically, from upland farmland, that's quite a small part of the catchment, and you're not going to get very much difference by planting trees there. Yes, you will get some difference, fact, but it's tiny. And if you were going to plan it like this, if you were doing it for flood protection, you'd only put the trees where it mattered for flood protection. So what he's done is raise a complete red herring, just like he did with the EU and the financing.
What's the best form of flood protection is nature. And the more woods you have, the more you trap the water upriver, upstream, up in the valley.
You see there, he's not understanding the simple mathematics. Right upstream, at the sort of origins of the river, if you like, right back to the sources, the catchment's very small. And the uphill part, if you take it down the catchment, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So it's very small. So you're going to make a small difference to a small part of the catchment. And it's not understanding that. As you get down into the towns, the valleys, etc., much wider, and you get a much bigger catchment and much more flood contribution. So you're talking about changing a small part by a small amount, but they're not planning even to do that. So he's really not understanding some basic things about catchments here.
And what the government in Wales is doing, it's going to pay the farmers for retaining the woodlands that they have currently and increasing the 7% to 10%. So they're being paid to do something.
So why are they up in arms about it?
Well, most people, if
why would they upset?
If I was being paid 88% of my income for doing nothing for the last 20 years.
In one sense, every subsidy is for doing nothing. Everyone, in every industry, is for doing nothing. But I'm sure the farmers of Wales would be really pleased to hear that they've been doing nothing for all these years. Never mind the beautiful landscape they've created for all of us. You know, the views, the tourist industry that's followed, etc. Because they're all interwoven and they're all being destroyed by net zero.
I'd be unhappy if the government changed it, wouldn't you?
No, look, first order, on the floods, you've got no evidence at all. As regards to Wetest Winter, can I just say this? About 2 years ago, we put up 12% more moisture in the atmosphere than the Tonga underwater volcano. We put an enormous amount of water vapor.
So is it the Wetest Winter ever?
No, I don't know, actually. I haven't looked that up. Okay. I'm almost certain it isn't. But that's weather anyway. If it was, that's weather. That's weather. Know. It's not climate.
Thank you.
Pattern of wetness is climate.
Yes.
A pattern of heat is climate.
And the Met Office
You're quoting weather. No, the Met Office are a voice. The Met Office won't even own up to their own annual report, which says 80s and 90s far worse storms than now. And now, when they're asked to prove it, they refuse to apologise. So that's how bad they are. We have a woke Met Office, not fit for purpose, but they've got a lot of high-paid jobs on it.
The wonderful thing about what the Welsh Government is doing is addressing major crises. So it's addressing the climate crisis, addressing the soil crisis, addressing the wood crisis, and addressing wildlife.
Oh, look at all the crises that are threatening us, the climate crisis. You know, we're told this last year, 2023 was the hottest year or 125,000 years. Totally absurd, that. And by the way, it was a hot year. It was a hot year on the oceans. It wasn't a hot year in Asia. It wasn't a hot year in Europe. It wasn't a hot year on the land masses. It was the natural things in the oceans that warmed up in cycles that I've explained in other videos that make it a hot year. Why? Because when you measure the global temperature, 71% of that mass is actually ocean. And it's oceans that contain 1,000 times or more heat than the atmosphere. It's the oceans that contain 50 times the amount of CO2 than the atmosphere. The oceans murmur and we change. And that's what happened. We had a really big El Nino, a super El Nino. We had the North Atlantic Decadal Oscillation, which is a 30-year warm period where it's warm for 30 years and it then cools. We're going into a cooling one for that now. So what we're going to see happening in the next few years is gradual cooling. And with the cooling, funnily enough, if we went back to the previous cooling, we'd have more droughts. It's the dry weather and cooling that causes droughts. Like I've mentioned, the 1976 drought was in a very cold decade, so cold that they thought the Ice Age was coming. So you really do have to begin to understand this. But above all, they're inventing crises. We've got a wildlife crisis in Wales. I bet you didn't know that. We've got a wood crisis in Wales. I bet you didn't know that. You know, everything is a crisis. You know why? This man depends on his income for a crisis. All those journalists, the environmental journalists, we didn't have those in the past, did we? All this scare story has created an entire industry that they all depend on. I don't. I actually pay to discuss this with him. He gets paid. He gets paid for all this alarmism. I don't. There's a huge difference there.
Wales is the 7th worst deprived wildlife nation on Earth. Almost all of its wildlife is gone. Why? Because they demolished all the woodlands on the uplands and they replaced them with sheep. And the sheep industry is 100% dependent on state subsidy to survive. There are 9.4 million sheep in Wales. Our taxes are subsidising and we're exporting to France.
Yeah, but that's all very well. But the farmers who actually do the job and live on the land have said that the steps that the government are taking will wreck their industry. That's what they're saying. Yeah. And that is the concern.
That's right.
And these are the farmers. These are the people on the land.
They're stealing the land. They're stealing the land. And they're pretending there's a problem on floods that isn't there, by the way. They're pretending a problem on floods. And you can't quote weather incidents anyway. A single winter's weather is not climate. You've got to understand that. And floods are not worse. And by the way, if you were doing it on flood protection, and I was involved in the Plinlimmon big investigation in mid-Wales where we set up whole areas studying the effect of forestry on floods, etc. I've gone into this. I was in charge hard. I used to pick up a red telephone and wake up a whole
Sorry, yeah.
My point is that there's no evidence there, and if there was going to be flooding, like you say, you put it in particular areas, but there's no rule to do that. You can put the woodlands anywhere.
20 seconds, you don't.
The sheep industry at the moment is an old industry that is dependent on hundreds of millions of pounds of state subsidy. That has got to come to an end. And we need for the government to pay farmers to do something as positive for Wales, protect its soil, protect its woodland and protect its wildlife.
Well, if what they're doing was beneficial to the farmers and the farmers were happy, they wouldn't be protesting and saying that it's going to cost more than 5,000 jobs. So it will be interesting to follow that. Donnacha McCarthy and also Paul Burgess, thank you very much.
As regards nature, I'm the first one to try to protect nature. I've campaigned all my life against water pollution and I've acted on it. I've donated to actions on it. Even as a child, I donated pocket money to it. I'm sure farmers are the first champions of the countryside. And if you want to improve nature, and in this report he's talking about species of moths and lizards going extinct in Wales, well, let's act by all means and do it by cooperating with the farmers. Talk to the farmers, see what can be done. I'm all for that. And I'm sure the farming community would react very positively to contributing to these things. Yes? So that is not the problem. But all you've heard from the other side there was things about flood protection which don't apply. The trees are not to do with that. The trees are to do with sequestering carbon. That's the reason, and that's the reason Drakeford told you, climate change. Certainly the 10% of the wilding is to do with nature, but if you just leave a field to wilding, and I've got experience of that, it'll get nature, it'll get lots of spiders, it'll get lots of grasshoppers, it'll get different species of wildflowers, great. But you can't take 10% of the land off people to do that, 10% of their income. And I think one of the biggest factors that comes to me that hasn't been mentioned, and I'm going to mention it now before I finish this video for the farmers in Wales and elsewhere, some of them have been on that land for hundreds of years, their families. They're attached to the land. And you're making it impossible with lots of things for them to stay that way. You are destroying it. You're destroying everything. And my message to farmers at the end of this video is if you accept or vote for any party, and I don't belong to a political party, but if you vote for any party that supports net zero, then you're a turkey voting for Christmas. Because it'll get far worse than this, what's coming. You're a turkey voting for Christmas. You should only support parties that agree to drop net zero. And you really have to drop any tribal authorities. I'm not interested in the Conservatives. I'm not interested in Labour or the Liberals or the Greens, because all of them support net zero. So you've got to really revolt on this. And if you really want to bring a shock and bring about change, then vote for people who are going to drop net zero. And only people who are going to do that. And that's my final message. I am not a farmer. I don't pretend to know about farming, but I pretend to know about science, and I want to be able to help the farming community. But my main message is get the pressure on to get a cost-benefit analysis. Show me the benefit. And whilst you're doing this, let me just give you one last graph, one last image. This is the plot of all the new coal power stations planned to be built in China soon. And it's over 600 of them. That is in addition to the enormous amount that's there now. The world is today putting out more fossil fuels, burning more fossil fuels than ever in human history. If Wales sank below the waves tomorrow and disappeared, it would be made up for in a matter of a week or two. What the UK does, and it's less than 1% of emissions now, what the UK does makes no difference at all, because we are in a world we are going to see much higher CO2 levels. And you know something? That's a very good thing. They are doing us a favour, because the world today is recording record harvests, and a big contributor to that is the level of CO2. After all, it is plant food, and you and I are made of it. Thank you for watching.